Welcome, friends, near and far, old and new. I'm Charles Knicker. I am the coordinator for the Ames United Church of Christ, Iowa Theologian in Residence program. And that's important because this program started with the idea for our annual event. This event has always been free and open to the public. And we've had speakers from diverse traditions. It began almost 40 years ago when our congregation decided that it had a hunger to deepen its understanding of worship, to be more fully informed as a community of learning, to become more effective then in social justice and outreach projects. In its 37 years, a rainbow of theologians, biblical scholars, ethicists, historians, musicians, artists, they've guided us and actually journeyed with us. Now, because this year's topic of climate change is a moral issue for all faiths, and especially for the United Church of Christ's long involvement with environment, it is appropriate that all levels of the church, from local to national, be involved. And for that reason, we have invited Iowa Conference UCC Minister Bridget Stevens to bring a greeting.
Dear friends, I am so glad that you are joining us today. I am the Reverend Bridget Stevens, Executive Conference Minister of the Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota Conferences of the United Church of Christ. And it is a delight for me to be a part of celebrating and sponsoring the Theologian in Residence event with our congregation, Ames United Church of Christ. This event has a long history of bringing together brilliant theologians to inspire, encourage, and even agitate, in the best sense of the word, our community to spur us on to deeper and more meaningful discipleship of Jesus Christ. It is a joy for me to represent the Iowa Conference of the United Church of Christ in welcoming the Reverend Berndt, Minister for Environmental Justice in the national setting of the United Church of Christ, as this year's Theologian in Residence at Ames UCC. The United Church of Christ has long been committed to acknowledging and heeding our call from God to love and care for all of creation as an action of our love for God and our discipleship of Jesus. We understand our responsibility to love God includes loving all of God's creation, and love is an action verb. We understand that loving our neighbors as ourselves, the second half of the Great Commandment, demands that we protect the resources for living, such as clean water, diverse ecosystems, arable and growable land, and sustainable practices that support all of life. Furthermore, we understand that the consequences of not acting urgently are literally life-threatening to us and our neighbors. And we know that our neighbors who live in the most vulnerable situations all around the globe already will continue to bear the greatest and swiftest burdens of inaction. It is our call as Christians, followers of Jesus, to look for ways to protect those who are most vulnerable. I trust that your spirit will be stirred, your questions will be deepened, and your being will be inspired to action during this great event. Thank you to all who are a part of creating and curating it. Thank you to the Reverend Berndt for wisdom and inspiration. Thank you to Ames United Church of Christ, the Iowa Conference United Church of Christ, the Central Association of the Iowa Conference, and countless others participating and bringing us all together in this way. Let us be blessed into action.
Well, thank you, Bridget. It's now my pleasure, honor to introduce Brooks. You've already heard some things about him. Officially, Brooks, who has been working with the UCC office, national office since 2015, his title is Minister for Environmental Justice. His spiritual journey has included being a pastor. His passion for learning led him to earn an earned doctorate at the Graduate Theological Union. And of course, I think many of you would be familiar with his book, Cathedral on Fire, now in its second edition. We gave a resounding yes to his proposal that the Theologian in Residence program become part of, or become the basis of this national webinar, or the first two sessions, because we, like him, believe it echoes a timeless prophetic message. You know, the theme is for us about the prophetic lessons for our climate crisis. We agree with him too, that scientific evidence and increasing natural disasters, that public actions on a large scale are required. Let me end with this remark from Martin Luther King Jr. I'm paraphrasing some of his words, which of course were written for the civil rights era, but I think extremely relevant today. Faith community should never be the master or the slave of the state. They must always be its conscience and guide. What is needed now is a prophetic zeal. And if there is no such zeal, faith communities are no more than a social club that deserves first to be ignored and then forgotten. So with zeal then, let us begin. Brooks?
Thank you so much, Charles, for that introduction, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to be a theologian in residence for Ames UCC. And I must say that your leadership has awakened me to the force and the power known as Charles. So thank you so much for all your work in organizing and spearheading this event. To set an overarching theme for my remarks, I want to begin with two little known and perhaps surprising facts about the prophet Isaiah. One little known fact about Isaiah is that he was married to a prophetess. The two were a power couple, to be sure. Unfortunately, due to sexism, we don't even know the name of this prophetess. We do know that she undoubtedly mustered a remarkable amount of courage at one point. And here we arrive at the second fact, and an eye-opening fact to be sure, about Isaiah. The book of Isaiah tells us that as an act of warning and protest against the ruling powers of his time, Isaiah walked around for 3 years barefoot and naked. I'm not even sure the word courage does justice to what it would have taken for our prophetess to remain married to Isaiah. I'll pause now to let all of the married couples in the audience consult with each other on what it would take to maintain the sacred vows of matrimony in such a moment. Now, I said that these little known facts would set the overarching theme for my remarks. When one talks about the faith of prophets, then one ultimately is talking in significant measure about the kind of faithful grounding and courage required to go into the public square and proclaim what in Isaiah's case was literally and metaphorically the naked truth. So it is this morning, I want to share with you what I think are 10 naked truths with which we must reckon in order to address the climate crisis today to the best of our abilities. The first 5 of these truths will build a case for why prophets are so relevant today. The second 5 of these truths will highlight some of the relevant lessons imparted from the prophets themselves. At the halfway point, I'll pause my talking for a bit so we can ponder an interactive question about prophets. Now, let's go ahead and begin. Naked truth number 1. Science tells us we can't wait any longer. The Boston University biochemist and famous science fiction writer Isaac Asimov once said, "The saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom." Most of my remarks today will focus on gathering the wisdom we need to confront the climate crisis. But in order to have that conversation on solid footing, we need to first establish some foundational facts and perspectives from the world's leading climate scientists and what they've been telling us in just this past month. On April 4th, through the scientists that comprise the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change formed by the United Nations, a new report was released on mitigating the climate crisis. In line with the goal of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures, and thereby prevent reaching an approximate tipping point that takes us from very bad to catastrophically bad, the report emphasized what such a goal requires from us in terms of how much and by when emissions need to be reduced. According to this report, the current rise in greenhouse gas emissions must peak before 2025 at the latest. Emissions must then be cut 43% by 2030. In other words, we have got 3 years to reverse our current upward trajectory before heading into a relatively rapid descent. As Jim Skea, one of the co-chairs for the working group that produced the report, noted, it's now or never if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. He adds, without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, it will be impossible. The implications of this science must be understood not only in terms of what happens if we don't act in terms of heat waves, droughts, floods, severe weather, and so forth, but also in terms of what we must do in the present moment with all expediency. First and foremost, it means we have to stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure. It means we have to abandon old fossil fuel infrastructure, and it means we have to ramp up renewable energy. In other words, we need to put an end to coal plants, gas plants, oil pipelines, offshore drilling, and more as we embrace the wind and the sun. With governments currently investing more in fossil fuels than renewable energy, there is a bigger picture to consider, which brings me to naked truth number 2. We are faced with more than a science problem. We are faced with a social change problem. I'll confess that when I read a new report, a new book, or watch a new film about the science of climate change, there's part of me that wants to run out into the street yelling and banging pots and pans saying, look, people, here's where we're headed. We got to wake up. Just look at the science. But here's the catch. By now, we have learned that simply exposing people to the science is not enough. Trying to scare people into doing the right thing with research and facts doesn't work. After all, not only have the leaders of the oil industry, but also the leaders of our government have known the science for more than 50 years. One response to this situation is to give up on those in charge of our economy and government to focus instead on what we can do as individuals in reducing our carbon footprint. At first, this approach might seem practical, tangible, hands-on approach. But let's think about it from a couple of different angles. First, solitary activities are typically hard to maintain, especially if there are not government incentives and policies nudging us in the right direction. One's energy runs the risk of fizzling out and leaving one feeling more disempowered than before. Second, there is the analogy of fighting a forest fire. If a forest fire is approaching one's home, none of us would say it makes sense to grab a bucket or a garden hose to try and face it down all by ourselves. It wouldn't even make sense to gather all the buckets in the neighborhood. At a certain point, the only sensible response is to call the fire department, to call upon the government to do what we cannot do as individuals or as small groups of people. As uncomfortable as pointing out this naked truth can be, we have reached a point where I think we need increasing honesty in making a distinction between responses to the climate crisis that are garden hose responses and responses to the climate crisis that operate on the scale necessary for us to have a fighting chance. We need solutions that match the problem. Sure, for the sake of moral integrity and for doing all that we can, continue to change light bulbs and eat less meat. It's not an either-or proposition I want to make. I change light bulbs and eat less meat. At the same time, we can't just do one side of the equation, that the equation one that focuses on individual activities. By far, the most practical course of addressing a problem as large as the climate crisis involves building a movement that compels our federal government to act, because only our federal government can provide a right-sized solution, especially in the time frame we are given. Now, for many of you, this statement may immediately bring to mind members of Congress who would not be described as climate champions. And thus, this naked truth may understandably be cause for despair, which brings me to naked truth number 3. We are faced not only with a social change problem, but also with a spiritual problem. The climate crisis today inevitably is a faith crisis. It can test how we respond to immense suffering. It can test what we think about the capacity of humanity to do what is right. It can test our moral stamina and our ability to spiritually endure. It can test whether or not we truly believe the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, as Martin Luther King Jr. once said. And when you get to such tests as these, well, it can ultimately become a question of what one thinks about God and where God resides amid this suffering and amid this injustice. When I do public speaking events on the climate crisis, I more often than not get a variation of what is essentially the same question during Q&A. It's a great question. The long version of the question might come from someone who's fairly well-versed in climate science. And it can take the form of an argument that the climate situation is actually worse than whatever I've indicated. And when I agree that there's nothing we can do about it, so why bother, since we're all going to hell in a handbasket, essentially. So when it comes to the science, I tend to stick to the key points of the most recent UN report for a variety of reasons. In short, it's based on scientific consensus, and to go broader and deeper than that would be a different keynote address. But I don't think this kind of question is really about the science, as important as that is. At its root, the why bother question is really about a spiritual problem: despair, hopelessness, the viability of faith itself. I don't believe there are any easy answers to this spiritual crisis, and I would be deeply skeptical if someone said there were. Humanity has never before faced something of this magnitude, but we can still learn from the prophets and the movements that have gone before us. One of my favorite historians often discuss the underdog status of movements before they become successful and the lessons these movements impart. Howard Zinn would talk about not throwing in your cards before the game is over, because there is still a chance that the winning cards might be in your hand. When I think about this metaphor in relationship to the climate crisis, it sparks 3 responses related to my faith and values. First, I'm going to keep on playing my cards despite the odds because I love my daughters. And I can't look them in the eye and say, I decided to throw in the cards on their future. Second, the theologian Paul Tillich said, faith is the basis for the courage to be, but I like to think that it's the courage to keep playing our cards despite the long odds. And then finally, third, like the Apostle Paul, who spoke of being fools for the sake of Christ, maybe there is some crazy, foolish madness to this faith business, and I'm just going to embrace that, which brings me to naked truth number 4. As unsettling as they may be, what we need now as much as ever are prophets. In the most famous book ever written about prophets, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once wrote that prophets are the most disturbing people who ever lived. If you think about it, this makes sense. In a society in which almost unfathomable levels of dysfunction have become the norm, in which myths and lies become commonplace, in which injustices are concealed and denied, then someone who is charged and called by the divine to tell the truth, to denounce regimes of injustice, to call upon society to do what is right, someone who does all of these things will inevitably be a disturbance to the status quo. Martin Luther King Jr. suggested the kind of orientation that a prophet must have when dysfunction has become normalized in a society. He said, there are certain things that our social order, within our social order, to which I am proud to be maladjusted. He went on to cite the prophet Amos and a string of change makers throughout history as being among the maladjusted. King declared that there was a need for a new organization called the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. For King, the salvation of the world resided in the creatively maladjusted. But before we rejoice in having identified our saviors, there's one more important thing to consider. Naked truth number 5. Each of you is needed among the ranks of the prophetic. I would say each of you is needed among the ranks of prophets, but I know some people get squeamish at the thought that they would assume the title the Holy Scriptures bestow upon special messengers from God. So even if you decline the title of prophet, I think all of us potentially have an inner prophet, or we can at least be part of what the Jesuit martyrs of El Salvador talked about when they encouraged the faithful to become a prophetic people and a prophetic church. To confront the climate crisis, we need more and more people to live into the prophetic tradition of our faith, because we can no longer wait on others to be our saviors. We have run out of time to wait for others. Now, some might resist being called a prophet or prophetic for another reason. Joan Chittister put her finger on this form of resistance in her book, The Cry of the Prophet, when she wrote, "It's a hard lesson, this awareness that what we know in our hearts to be the will of God, we must speak in the light. It is a lesson we try consistently to avoid. We don't rock boats, we don't talk politics, we don't mind other people's business, we go along. We are not the prophetic type. And yet it is to our normal little worlds that each of us is called to be a prophet now." Chittister goes on to say that as long as the work of God on earth is undone, then there is a call and a cry to the prophet in each of us, muted for years perhaps, but forever on call. She then adds, who knows, it may be precisely you and your insights, your average voice, and your clear-hearted vision for which the world now awaits. The good news is that the timeless wisdom of the prophets in our sacred scriptures has remarkable relevancy for today. But before we get to that, let's pause for a second. I would like to hear from you all in the chat box in response to a question I have. Please type in the chat box the name of someone who comes to mind when you think of a prophet or a prophetic leader for justice whose mission and voice was so inspiring that it created a prophetic spark within you. It made you feel like you wanted to stand up and speak out. It made you feel like you wanted to commit yourself to the work of justice. Feel free to type the name of that person in the chat box. All right, I see some pastors listed: William Barber, Martin Luther King Jr., Greta Thunberg, Richard Rohr, Harvey Bates, Toni Morrison, Troy Perry, Jim Hansen. It's going too fast for me to keep up. John Lewis, Paul Knicker, Phil Berrigan, William Sloan Coffin, Raphael Warnock, Douglas Tallamy. Wow, John Deere. I love John Deere. He's wrote one of the best things I think there is on prophets. Tracy Blackman, since that's my boss, I will say that's the most wonderful. James Cone, MLK Jr., terrific. Ron Esslinger, Harvey Milk. Well, I'm not sure who put down Brooks Barron, but I'll have to remind people the question there. Walter Brueggemann, Thich Nhat Hanh. These are terrific, and believe me, I'm going to ponder and look up some of these names if I do not already know them. Thanks so much for participating and answering that question. There are a lot of powerful sources of inspiration listed here, and I hope we are able to hold on to these names as touchstones that uplift us in our work. Prophets often have a contagious courage that can help keep us going. In my following remarks, I'm going to dig into the aspects of what prophetic courage often requires as we look at 5 more naked truths. Naked truth number 6. Being prophetic often means confronting the powerful with a demand. The granddaddy of all the prophets in the Bible is Moses. He sets the template for what it means to be a prophet. Now imagine the story of Moses without him confronting Pharaoh with his famous demand, "Let my people go." Without this, there really is no story. Without God sending Moses to deliver this bold demand, Moses' life would have largely consisted of him tending to Jethro's flocks. Similarly, imagine if our approach to the climate crisis boiled down to making better consumer choices or living a simple life without ever making demands of the government officials who hold power in our society. One can live a morally pure life tending to sheep, but change comes by applying one's morals to those in power, to those on the throne. Naked truth number 7. Being prophetic means going public. Prophets are to send a message, but it's not a private message. Jeremiah, for example, was a youth when God instructed him to be a prophet to the nations. And like Moses, the idea of taking on the prophetic mantle of confronting rulers filled him with fear and trepidation. Jeremiah was given the unenviable divine authority to, quote, pull down and overthrow kingdoms. With such a daunting task placed upon him, Jeremiah was to gird up his loins and make his denunciations in, quote, the hearing of all Jerusalem. The social part of social change requires taking action in public. Jeremiah could have conducted a private letter writing campaign with the king, but undoubtedly none of us would now have known Jeremiah's name if that had been his approach. Similarly, if we truly want to change the system and the policies that have brought us to this point, we will need to muster the courage to go beyond online action alerts, petitions, and tweets to make our demands in the public square. To me, this dimension of prophetic action points to what catalyzes change. One of the things we have learned from the history of movements, from the Civil Rights Movement to the Tea Party movement, is that public action creates public conversation that shifts public opinion, and then ultimately changes how people vote and what laws get passed. We don't get to that endpoint of new laws and policies without those initial prophetic actors who step out in public and inspire others to step out as well. Now, not all movements are the same. There is a difference between the Civil Rights Movement and the Tea Party movement. Some movements have helped us put us in this negative place that we are in today, which brings me to naked truth number 8. Being prophetic is about justice. Some years ago, I was at a large church gathering where the word justice was being used a lot. And I remember one of the pastors questioned this focus on justice because he felt like that word didn't appear much in the Bible. Now, I didn't agree with him on that. The word righteousness appears over 250 times in the Bible, and that word can easily be translated as justice. Truly, who uses the word righteousness these days? Justice would probably be a better translation for our modern language, but I digress. In reading the Bible, what you find over and over again is rulers and entire societies straying from God and from justice until a prophet answers the call and points them back in the right direction. My favorite writers in talking about the prophets of the Bible often happen to be Catholic. And one of the prophets I find discussed in their writings, and who I don't see discussed as much elsewhere, is Mary. There is a rich conversation about why Mary is considered a prophet that I won't dive into today, but Mary is an excellent example of the justice orientation of the prophetic tradition in the Bible. In one of the most revolutionary passages of the Bible, Mary's Magnificat, she declares that God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. It was this historical embodiment of divine justice that the coming of Jesus represented for her. As a teenage Jewish Palestinian girl in the backwaters of a mighty empire, her faith centered upon the kind of justice that rises as the people rise. We need that kind of justice because it speaks to the heart of what is needed. The leading environmental justice scholar Robert Buller notes that underlying the climate crisis is an apartheid system of global decision-making. He observes equity has to take center stage because the people who have contributed the least to climate change and global warming are the ones that feel it first, worst, and longest. Racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, global justice, all of the many dimensions of justice are intertwined with the climate crisis. Buller notes justice can't be a footnote. Justice has to be at the center of everything. From a faith perspective, justice can be seen as the divine animating spark and force that puts us back on the right path. But unfortunately, in a lot of churches, there can be some barriers to letting that spark catch fire, which brings me to naked truth number 9. Being prophetic can throw you into a thorny thicket or a briar patch, if you will. Before I get to the particularly subjects involved with this truth, I want to take a step back to talk about the big picture of how those in power stay in power. What I want to suggest to you is that part of why people in positions of power can continue government investment in fossil fuels and keeping the fossil fuel industry on life support is because there is a culture in our society that insulates them from public pressure and protest. The thorny thicket, the briar patch that I want to discuss is part of that culture which protects the powerful, which protects the fossil fuel industry. There is perhaps one word that more than any other represents this briar patch in many churches today. It's a word that has become like a 4-letter word. In fact, there are likely pastors and church members who would rather be called a 4-letter word than be accused of this and find themselves sitting among the thistles and thorns. If you've not already guessed it, the word I have in mind is the word political. The word political is political. It is often used in reference to matters related to justice and matters that are deemed controversial, upsetting, divisive. While an academic might define the word political as being about struggles over power, in everyday use, it frequently has a more narrow connotation of partisan battles between Republicans and Democrats. Faith leaders today will sometimes go to very explicit lengths to distance themselves from this partisan meaning. The Reverend William Barber will often talk about the justice issues facing the poor as not being about right versus left, but about right versus wrong. Barber reframes justice issues as being first and foremost moral rather than political matters. Even with such redefinitions, it can still be hard to extricate oneself from the briar patch. Now, in biblical times, the briar patch was, generally speaking, a lot more dangerous than it is in a lot of our churches. In the Beatitudes, Jesus describes the briar patch for prophets as persecution. That's how the powerful were protected in that context. And unfortunately, we know that in many parts of the world today, environmentalists are persecuted and killed. The assassination of Berndt Caceres in Honduras is sadly but one example. In the United States, violence isn't usually needed to silence people about the climate crisis. Our culture does the job just fine. So in some religious cultural environments, simply saying the word climate can trigger accusations of being political. I wish there was some easy answer for resolving this situation in a society that is becoming more and more polarized. I think there is something to be said for workshops on best practices for dealing with conflict in productive and healthy ways. While the problem of this polarization may originate from the broader society, there is something unhealthy going on when churches can't be a place for discussing the most pressing matters of today. Jesus stepped into places of conflict and tension amid the faithful of his time, and he offered some helpful words in the Beatitudes. All those people who are committed to righteousness, to justice, to peace, to the beloved community, all those people who are committed despite persecution, despite the odds, Jesus tells us that those people are blessed. Sometimes a prophet needs to not only denounce the actions of those in power, but also take a moment to let those around them know that they are blessed. Sometimes we as a prophetic people need the mutual support and affirmation from each other. Sometimes we need those friendly faces and encouraging voices at green team meetings. Sometimes we need to pause during a webinar of people committed to climate justice and think, maybe all of us here are blessed. No one should be alone in the briar patch. We get out of it by joining together, by supporting each other, by being a blessing to each other. Naked truth number 10. Being prophetic is a long distance race. During this upcoming month, there is a tremendous need for public prophetic actions because there is this limited window of time in which climate legislation in Congress has a real chance of being passed. Will it be everything we hope and dream for? Probably not. But could it be the first step that Congress has ever taken on climate? Yes. Could it make a big difference? Yes. Regardless of what happens, continued public actions will be needed afterward. I'm a fan of the Green New Deal because, as Bill McKibben has said, it's a vision for a policy that operates on the scale that is needed. We need legislation that will rapidly transition us to a cleaner, more just society. We have a lot more work to do to build a movement big enough and strong enough to achieve that vision. In all his barefooted and naked glory, the prophet Isaiah not only had a vision, but he had some stamina when it came to doing what is right. He pointed to faith as the source of that stamina when he said, "Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Back when I was younger and thinner, I ran a couple of marathons that almost made me want to faint. And I never would have done that first marathon if it wasn't for my running partner. We would run together a couple of times a week, and I remember it was always tough getting motivated to get out there and take those first few steps, but we did it together. And it's been said that faith is stepping out on nothing and landing on something. Let's step out on faith together. Let's step out on that path of justice that the Hebrew prophets pointed us toward all those many years ago. Let's step out together with the faith of prophets. Amen.
Hello, I'm Charles again, and he has asked me to facilitate the questions and answers. And again, I want to point out that as I've looked down at the chats, Brooks, at one time we had 80 messages on chats, and then I think they cleaned out and we had another 80. But we've asked people to use, at the bottom of the screen, use questions and answers. So I'll be looking at that for the questions. I have two to start with, Brooks. One of them says, or it's a request for visuals, and someone said keeping track of all 10 of those. I don't know if can we show a visual later, or is that just going to be some way? How can people remember those 10 that you've done? Let's start with that one.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, I did debate on whether or not I should have a PowerPoint slide for those 10 naked truths, and and it wasn't vanity that made me decide not to do it, so everybody can look at me for that period. But I just thought, one list of 10 might get a little boring, but to look at. But certainly we will send out to everyone who registered for this event. We will send out a list of the 10 so that you can see it all in one place.
Right. So again, I'm reminding anyone who wants to ask a question to go to the Q&A icon down at the bottom. All right, another question that came in, focused on, we hear, as this anonymous attendee said, we hear a lot about eat less meat, but then the whole point about factory farming is a massive player in this effort. So what do you want to say, or what would you say about the business of, say, massive farming and eating of meat?
Yeah, I did actually think about putting in a section on that in my remarks, but for the sake of economy of words, I decided not to, because it can take a little more getting into. But I think, undoubtedly, when we think about, industries that have put us into the place where we're not just talking about the fossil fuel industry, we're also talking about the corporate agriculture industry. And in the most recent report, I don't have the numbers on me right now, but a good significant percentage of our greenhouse gas emissions is connected to our agricultural industry. And so there's certainly, I think, to me, I think, I'm right with people in saying we should, eat less meat and so forth. I think at the same time, a lot of serious thought needs to be given as to policies that will move us in that direction. I would say, there tends to be less visible, serious discussion of that within the climate movement. That's a kind of a frequent criticism, if you will. But there are definitely people out there who are putting thought to that and are doing good work on that. So I think looking at people who are focused on kind of regenerative agriculture and alternatives to our current agricultural practices is certainly something that really is an important part of this conversation, and I don't wish to minimize it.
Mm-hmm. All right, another question to share is that I'll bring up is, how do you speak to climate deniers? Because there still are some out there today. How can you have a meaningful conversation with a climate denier?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I realize like that's often a concern, and that can be a daily struggle if it's within the context of one's friends, family, and relatives. I think there are some great people and organizations that provide kind of tips and talking about Catherine Hayhoe. She's one of our leading climate scientists. She does a lot. We actually hosted her for a webinar on how to have climate communications. Organizations like Echo America and Blessed Tomorrow is their faith wing. They put out materials on having conversations. So those are there. I will say, at the same time, because it's never an either or thing, but I will say at the same time, I think, right now we are at a point where we have the numbers needed in society who, believe climate change is an issue and that we need renewable energy. When you look at the polls, we actually have the majority, we have the numbers that we need. So I don't, expending time on people who are going to be very hard to convert and most likely aren't going to be converted, if we're honest. I don't think that's the right place. I am actually a believer in preaching to the choir and then getting the choir out into the streets singing their song. I think that's actually what's most needed. So if I it's not to say we shouldn't be talking to the unconverted, but it's to say if you're talking about where you should focus your energy, I think, singing the song in the streets is the place to focus one's energy with the choir.
All right, another question has come in, and just kind of a lead-in statement from Richard. It said, most liberal churches relegate religious activities to personal devotion and politics to political ideologies like socialism or critical race theory, whatever. So question, how can we create a liberal political theology to guide us?
Yeah. I think, that there's already people kind of creating theology in that sphere. Just in my remarks today, I think, for me, a big inspiration, as I said, are Catholic writers from, Joan Chittister to Jim Deere. And then there's also really others who have written, great books. I'm drawing a blank on one name at the minute, but I think, what I would say is that we are in a situation when you're looking at the bigger picture, and Jim Antal has been a great voice for this, is that the climate crisis really, if we are to meet it as people of faith, it's going to provoke a reinventing of churches. And so, part of that is undoubtedly theology. And I do think there are people out there who Christianity is always of many strands, and there are strands, that have been there, and that we can pick up on those strands. I'm personally, it may be out of favor in some of our seminaries, but I'm always a big fan of liberation theology. That's a strand I still think is one for us to be picking up and carrying forward.
All right. And this is from someone in Ohio who said, how does the gas from landfills play a part in the climate crisis?
I think, we're talking about, methane pollution there. I wouldn't, I think that's a real concern for us is that component. I think there's a lot of issues, and it's also an area in which government leadership is needed, because the current set of affairs right now in many communities is there's not a lot of recycling. Often what we think is being recycled isn't being recycled. A lot of communities don't provide for public composting, and so there's a host of things that need to be worked out. And I think, again, it comes back to government policies, taking into the science of what the dangers are from how we currently are dealing with our waste.
Okay. Oh, here's a great question about our youth. So how do we support youth who are feeling eco-stress and the resulting eco-trauma? How can we harness the energy of youth to energize us adults?
Yeah, undoubtedly, we want to be as supportive as possible to our youth. Many of our youth have kind of stepped up and have been tremendous leaders right now with the climate strikes and so forth. I think for churches, one of the best things we can do to confront the climate crisis is to give the microphone to youth during worship services, to let youth take over the sermon. Because that is something that hits people in a far different way than myself or someone who's of the older generations talking about climate crisis, because they're going to be experiencing the worst impacts in ways that those of us who are older won't. And so one of the longtime leaders in the Green Church movement, the Reverend Bob Shore-Goss, I remember when he, after a Sunday in which he had a youth preach, Bob's been doing, creation-oriented sermons for and worship service for 30 years, but he emailed me right afterwards and said, that was the best service we have ever had on environmental issues. And this is coming from someone who's probably done more of these services than anybody. And so I really recommend that. But in having youth as leaders, it means that we also have to provide the support. And I think, this gets back to what churches do best, when we're at our best, which is providing those communities of mutual support, to provide spaces and places for people to share and to receive that support from others. It's been said that for illness to become wellness, the I needs to become a we, right? And so that it really is about communities providing that space and place for that to happen.
Okay. And a little pride here. We have from one of our Ames UCC members, says, the United Church of Christ has been a leader in shaping the global dialogue concerning environmental justice. Now, how can we do the same for climate change issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think there is something to be said when you look at the history of the environmental justice movement. Every time I go to that history, I learn something new. And I really encourage, if you don't know it, look it up and familiarize yourself with it. I shared that history with just yesterday with 150 fourth graders, and they got pumped up. I mean, I've never seen people so pumped up over something little old me said, but it was the story that just got these fourth graders pumped up. And it was the story of the environmental justice movement and going back to Warren County. And, what happens with movements, to go back to my remarks, you have courageous people who come out and take a stand publicly. And we know that what was for the environmental justice movement, what the Montgomery bus boycott was to the civil rights movement, was 6 weeks of people putting their bodies on the road to prevent dump trucks from dumping a known carcinogen in their community. And people who, like Dolly Burwell and her 10-year-old daughter Kimberly, who showed up and got arrested that first day. And when Kimberly then was interviewed by Dan Rather as her mother was being arrested that first day, and that interview went all over the nation on the nightly news and pricked people's consciousness and moved their hearts and minds. That's what faith communities can do. I mean, we may not have always have the equivalent of Dan Rather when we do stuff in public with us, but it's doing those public actions that really do something that speak louder than a statement, right? I mean, it's good to come up with well-crafted statements. I get involved in that at times, but really we need more of the public actions to inspire people.
Right. Then another question referred back to your mention of Catherine Hayhoe, and ask the full name, and I happen to know it's with a K, Catherine, and then Hayhoe is Hayhoe, and right, she has a new book out, as I recall, that would have some of this information on deniers. Do you want to say anything more about Catherine? And
yeah, we can certainly provide further information where people can go to get those resources. My schedule hasn't permitted me yet to I know she has this news book. I haven't had a chance to sit down and read it myself, but I think she certainly is someone who's really good. And she's someone who also, comes as a background where she's very explicit about her background as an evangelical Christian, which I think, she's had these conversations. She knows from experience how to have these conversations, and she's just extremely gifted at it. So we'll make sure people have access to that.
all right, another question, and they're wonderful, but we're getting a number here. How are we to address the sensitive and troublesome issue of CO2 and the need to reduce it? And how can we do that because we cannot stop fossil fuel growth?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if we're not stopping fossil fuel growth, that's like, as I said, throwing in the cards. There's no kind of getting around it. You know, some people, I think, one of the things that, the fossil fuel industry in particular would like to have us believe that we'll, come up with these technologies that will allow them to keep on polluting, and we'll just, at some later point, we'll take the carbon out of the air. But, no such technologies currently exist, and they certainly don't exist on the scale that would be needed. And the cost projections are kind of made up when people look at that. And so I think there's, I wish I could tell people that there's a silver bullet or easy way to go about these things, but really at the end of the day, we can't use any more fossil fuels. It's just that, I can't tell you any other way around it. It's just one of those hard truths.
Right. All right, here, another question. What are your thoughts about how to foster nationwide conversations about climate justice across UCC churches? Kind of a follow-up is, how do we build political power in the UCC?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm sure it takes many different forms and depending on what community you're in and where you're located. That for me, when I was a pastor in the state of Washington, and in many West Coast communities, the Sierra Club is really the presence and the force, right, in certain communities. And so looking, connecting with people who are maybe in your community are already leading the effort, leading the way, is always recommended. And that organization could be different in different places. We know, certainly in many states across the country, Interfaith Power and Light is bringing people together, and we're fortunate to have the executive director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light on our panel coming up. And so, certainly looking to those organizations. I think also to be sure that what I have experienced, I'm based in Cleveland, with the push over the last several months to support Build Back Better, that when it comes to people taking public action out front of, in our case, Senator Portman's office, the great allies have been from the labor movement, and have also been from the Poor People's Campaign. I think the Poor People's Campaign is really a shining example of a faith an organization with a strong faith component to it that has been taking public action in many different communities across the nation. And of course, they're now mobilizing people for Washington, D.C. as well. But I think they're an organization really to look to as a partner in your community if they have a presence, and they do have a presence in many communities. So those are some of the people in the organizations I would think to look to.
Well, perhaps this is a kind of a follow-up. A question said here: what platforms are available for us activists to find solidarity, to share ideas, both about our successes and failures, and offer encouragement to this effort? And through those platforms, how can we invite others to join us? So are there other platforms?
Yeah. Well, I think certainly, different denominations often have different networks. In the United Church of Christ, we've got the Council for Climate Justice, where we have a lot of rich conversations, I believe, where we're always trying to figure out what can we do now, and what's, and thinking about what's effective. And so I think trying to find those networks, depending on where you are, they can be, I think, a really great place. And then I also know people, Reverend Rashinda out in Oregon, who brings people together. She does an online climate cafe that is a wonderful, mutually supportive community where you can have these kind of conversations. So people are taking the initiative to do these things in different parts of the country to bring people together to have these conversations that we need to have.
Oh, there are a number of other questions, Brooks, but I'm looking at the time. Do we need to bring this to a close? And I'm sorry we can't answer all of them, but we'll keep track of them for sure. So thank you all for these wonderful questions.